The air in the private room of the Sourdough Stag was thick with the scent of old leather and expensive whiskey, a manufactured frontier masculinity that felt as fake as the lacquered pine logs lining the walls. The heads of moose and caribou stared down from on high, their glass eyes holding a permanent, placid surprise. There were 6 of us, dressed in the practical flannel and canvas of men who worked with their hands. And then there was Mr. Sterling. He sat at the head of the heavy oak table, a cashmere sweater the color of winter dusk draped over his thin frame. He didn't belong here, and he knew it, wearing his wealth like a tailored suit of armor. I nursed a glass of water, the ice cubes clinking like a distant, nervous bell. My mind was miles away, in a sterile white room where the only sound was the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The number Sterling had quoted over the phone echoed in my head, $150,000. Enough to cover the experimental treatment, enough to buy my mother more time, enough to make me sit here and listen to a rich man's fantasy. "Gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice smooth and cultured, devoid of any Alaskan grit. He slid a sleek portfolio across the table. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I've gathered you because you are, by all accounts, the best at what you do." Frank, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard winters and harder fights, leaned forward and grunted, "Cut the preamble, Sterling." "What's the job?" Frank was a trapper of the old school. He saw the world in terms of snares, bait, and profit. He'd been the one to call me, his voice crackling over the satellite phone. "Easy money, Ethan." The kind you can't say no to. Sterling offered a thin, bloodless smile. He opened the portfolio. Inside were high-resolution satellite images of a jagged, unforgiving stretch of the Alaska Range. A place so remote it was just a blank spot on most maps. He tapped a finger on a deep, shadowed valley. "Here," he said, "approximately 300 miles northwest of here. A place the old Athabascans called the Valley of Long Shadows." He then laid out a series of photographs. They were grainy, clearly taken with a long lens or a game camera, but the subject was unmistakable. A track. A paw print pressed deep into the snow, so large it made the quarter placed next to it for scale look like a dime. It was canine, but impossibly big. Larger than any bear print I'd ever seen. "I've had a team monitoring this area for 6 months, Sterling continued, his eyes gleaming with a cold, acquisitive fire. "They've collected hair samples, scat, and these photos. The DNA is inconclusive. It's Canis lupus, but with genetic markers that haven't been seen in 10,000 years. A relic population. A giant Ben, the youngest of our crew, a kid barely out of his teens with a hero worship complex for Frank, let out a low whistle. A dire wolf? Perhaps, Sterling said, a hint of condescension in his tone. Or something even more unique. I am a collector, gentlemen. I collect things that are one of a kind. A Rembrandt, a Stradivarius, and now this. I don't want the whole animal. I don't have room for a full mount. I want the skull. Cleaned, of course. For my study? He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, thick as cigar smoke. $150,000, split 6 ways upon delivery of the trophy. $25,000. The number seared itself into my brain. I thought of the stack of medical bills on my kitchen counter, of the tired, hopeful look in my mother's eyes. Before I left the Park Service, I swore I was done with this life. Done with killing things, done with the cold and the silence. But the wilderness didn't send you bills with late fees. Frank slapped his hand on the table, making the glasses jump. You've got yourself a deal. We'll get you your oversized puppy skull." He looked around the table, his gaze a challenge. "Anyone got a problem with that?" Marcus, a quiet veteran I'd served with in the same ranger unit, just gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. He was a man of few words, but absolute reliability. Leo, a twitchy guy from Fairbanks who was always complaining, shivered despite the room's warmth. "As long as the pay is good, I don't care if we're hunting a damn ghost." Owen, a stocky, silent man, simply nodded in agreement. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their expectation, but it was Sterling's cold, obsessive stare that unnerved me. This wasn't just a hunt for him. It was a conquest. He wasn't looking for a specimen. He was looking to possess something wild and unique, to put its skull on a shelf and prove his dominion over it. A knot of unease tightened in my gut. This felt wrong. The money was clean, but the motive felt dirty. But then, the image of my mother's face flashed in my mind again, her frail hand in mine. The quiet dignity with which she faced her illness. My moral compass, usually so steady, spun wildly. What was one animal's life, however unique, compared to hers? "I'm in," I said, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. Sterling's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. The plane leaves from Lake Hood tomorrow at dawn. Pack for extreme cold. My pilot will take you as far as he can. From there, you are on your own." He closed the portfolio with a soft, final click. The deal was done. Outside, the Anchorage city lights felt a million miles away from the primeval darkness we were about to enter. The roar of the de Havilland Beaver's single-prop engine was a deafening, rattling beast that seemed to be actively trying to shake itself apart. We were crammed inside the small cabin, a tangle of limbs, rifles, and high-tech winter gear. Below us, civilization had vanished. There were no roads, no power lines, just an endless, brutal expanse of white peaks and dark, forest-choked valleys. It was a landscape that didn't care if you lived or died. It was the truest kind of wilderness, the kind that made you feel like an insignificant speck of dust. Our pilot, a leathery old-timer named Gus, banked the plane, and a frozen lake, the color of a dead man's eye, appeared below. "This is as far as I go," he yelled over the engine. "The ice is thick enough. I'll be back in 1 week. If you're not here, I wait 24 hours, then I'm gone. Any longer, and the weather window closes for the season. You got that?" We all nodded. The float plane, equipped with skis, touched down with a shudder and a long, grating scrape across the snow-dusted ice. When Gus killed the engine, the silence that rushed in was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed in on my eardrums. The air was so cold it felt like breathing in microscopic shards of glass. Each inhalation a tiny pain in the back of my throat. We unloaded our gear, snowmobiles, tents, crates of food, and enough firepower to start a small war, and watched as the Beaver took off, its red and white frame shrinking against the pale sky until it was gone. And then we were alone. The lake was bordered on all sides by a solid wall of black spruce and the skeletal, needleless silhouettes of larch trees. The mountains rose up behind them, their granite faces scoured clean by an eternity of wind. There was no birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just the profound, unnerving quiet of a world deep in hibernation. It was a beautiful place, in a severe and unforgiving way, but it felt watchful. We set up our base camp on the edge of the tree line, a small cluster of geodesic dome tents designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. The work was hard and fast, a practiced rhythm of men who knew how to survive in the wild. Frank directed the setup with gruff efficiency, while Marcus, ever the soldier, meticulously established a clear perimeter. By late afternoon, we were ready for a preliminary scout. "Ethan, Marcus with me," Frank ordered. "The rest of you, finish setting up and get a fire going. We're going to find where our big boy dens." We mounted our snowmobiles, the two-stroke engines screaming in protest against the cold, and set off, following the coordinates from Sterling's satellite maps. We moved into the valley he'd pointed out, a deep cleft in the mountains that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't take long to find them. The tracks. Frank killed his engine, and we glided to a stop. There they were, a line of them stitched across a wide, open snowfield. They were just as the pictures had shown, each print the size of a dinner plate, pressed a good 6 inches into the hard-packed snow. The stride was immense, easily 12 feet between prints. Whatever made this was impossibly large and heavy. "Holy Mother," Ben whispered over the radio from back at camp, where he was monitoring our comms. Frank just grinned, a predatory light in his eyes. Pay dirt. But I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, which was already dropping toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit. I dismounted and knelt beside a track, my training as a park ranger kicking in. The print was perfectly clear. 5 toes, non-retractable claw marks. Definitely canine. But something was off. I walked along the track line, my gaze fixed on the snow, and then I saw it. For about 20 yards, the tracks were consistent, the gait a familiar lupine lope. Then, the pattern changed. The massive wolf prints vanished. In their place, for a stretch of about 30 feet, were 2 distinct lines of different prints. They were long, narrow, and looked unnervingly like the tracks of a large, barefoot man. The stride was shorter, the gait bipedal. And then, just as suddenly, the bipedal tracks disappeared, and the enormous wolf prints resumed their path into the darkening woods. "Frank, come look at this," I said, my voice tight. He and Marcus came over. Frank stared at the tracks, his brow furrowed. "What in the hell?" Marcus knelt, tracing the outline of one of the humanoid prints with a gloved finger. He didn't say anything, but the usual calm on his face was replaced by a look of deep unease. "Melt and refreeze," Frank said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Sun hits the snow weird. The wind blows it around. It makes strange shapes. I've seen it 100 times. Not like this. You haven't," I countered. "Look at the weight distribution. The clear heel strike. The splay of the toes. This isn't a trick of the light, Frank. Something walked here." On 2 legs, Frank kicked at the snow with his boot, erasing one of the strange prints. "We're here for a wolf, not some damn Sasquatch. Let's not get spooked by shadows." We follow the big tracks. That's where the money is. He turned and stomped back to his snowmobile, his bravado a thin shield against the encroaching weirdness. Marcus met my eyes for a long moment. He had seen the same thing I had. The tracks weren't an anomaly. They were a transformation. I stood there as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting the valley in a deep purple gloom. Frank could dismiss it all he wanted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't hunting a simple animal. We were in a place that didn't follow the rules I knew. This land was ancient, and the things that lived here were ancient too. And they were hostile to our intrusion. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore. It was seeping into my bones, a primal fear that whispered we had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The next 2 days were a blur of methodical preparation. The creature's tracks led to a narrow, winding canyon, a natural bottleneck carved through the rock by some long, dead glacier. It was the perfect place for an ambush. If the beast used this route to travel between its hunting grounds and whatever lair it called home, it would have to pass through here. "It's a kill box," Marcus had observed, his voice a low rumble as we surveyed the area from a high ledge. "We set up here, we'll have a clear field of fire from 100, maybe 120 yards. It won't even know we're here until it's too late." The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. We spent the better part of a day hunting, and Owen, a surprisingly good shot for such a quiet man, brought down a large caribou. We hauled the carcass back to the canyon on a sled towed behind a snowmobile, the effort leaving us breathless in the thin, frigid air. The smell of the fresh kill felt like a violation in this sterile, silent place. We positioned the deer in the center of the canyon floor, a gruesome offering on an altar of snow. Then we waited. We took up our positions on the rocky outcrop Marcus had identified. It gave us a commanding view, but the wind was relentless, slicing through our layers of thermal gear with surgical precision. We set up a small, camouflaged blind, just big enough for the 6 of us to huddle in. The cold was a physical enemy, leaching warmth, slowing thought, making every muscle ache. Leo was miserable, his teeth chattering in a constant, irritating rhythm. "I can't feel my feet," he whined. "How long do we have to sit here?" "As long as it takes," Frank growled, not taking his eyes off his rifle's thermal scope. "Now shut up." "You'll spook it." Night fell not as a gentle curtain, but as a sudden, suffocating blanket of black. The temperature plummeted. -20, then -30. The only light came from a sliver of a moon and something far more spectacular. The aurora borealis began to shimmer into existence. Vast, silent ribbons of phosphorescent green and violet dancing across the heavens. It was an otherworldly spectacle, beautiful and terrifying in its scale. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like the sky itself was alive, watching us with a cold, cosmic indifference. The silence returned, deeper than before. The only sounds were the creak of our gear, the whisper of the wind, and the occasional explosive crack of a tree limb freezing and splitting somewhere in the dark forest. Hours crawled by. My body went numb, my mind drifting into a half-conscious state of cold-induced misery. I thought about my mother, about the warmth of her hospital room, and it felt like a memory from another lifetime. It was Ben who saw it first. He was on watch with me, his young face pale in the faint green glow from the sky. He suddenly stiffened, his hand gripping my arm. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Over there." On the other side of the canyon, I raised my binoculars, my frozen fingers fumbling with the focus wheel. I scanned the deep shadows clinging to the far canyon wall, a mess of rock and stunted snow-dusted pines. At first I saw nothing. Then I caught it, a flicker of movement. It wasn't an animal, not in the way I understood it. It was a patch of darkness, a piece of the night that was somehow blacker than the surrounding shadows. And it was moving. The movement was utterly unnatural. It didn't walk or crawl. It seemed to flow. It elongated, stretching like taffy, then compressed into a dense, compact shape. It was as if it had no fixed form, no bones or solid structure. It was pure, liquid shadow. "What is that?" Ben breathed, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and terror. "I don't know," I said honestly, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. Every instinct honed by years in the wilderness was screaming at me. Wrong. This is wrong. I nudged Frank, who was dozing lightly, his head resting against his pack. He jolted awake, instantly alert. "What is it?" "Opposite wall. In the trees," I said, pointing. Frank raised his thermal scope. We heard his sharp intake of breath. "I've got a heat signature. A big one. But it's shifting. The shape keeps changing. I can't get a lock." The blackness on the far side of the canyon stilled. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The world held its breath. The aurora above us pulsed. A silent, ghostly heartbeat. We were all frozen. 6 men on a ledge, staring into an abyss that was staring back. Then the shadow began to coalesce. It drew itself together, gathering mass from the darkness around it, pulling itself into a solid, 3-dimensional form. The process was silent, seamless, and utterly horrifying. It was like watching a nightmare being born. Limbs unfolded from the blackness. A head took shape. Slowly, deliberately, a creature stepped out of the shadows and into the pale, ethereal moonlight. And the silence of the Alaskan night was finally, truly broken. It moved into the sliver of moonlight on the canyon floor, and the world seemed to shrink until it was the only thing in it. The word wolf was an insult to what we were seeing. It was immense, standing on 4 legs, yet its shoulders were level with my chest, a good 5 feet off the ground. If it were to rise on its hind legs, it would tower over any man. Its fur was the color of tarnished silver, catching the faint light in a way that made it look spectral, unreal. But it was the details that were so hideously wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at angles that seemed subtly incorrect, giving it a gangly, spider-like posture. The head was lupine, but the snout was shorter, the jaw more powerful, and the brow was heavy, intelligent. And its eyes, they didn't reflect the moonlight like a normal animal's. They glowed with a faint internal luminescence, like dying embers in a pit of charcoal. There was a chilling, calculating sentience in its gaze as it surveyed the baited caribou, then slowly lifted its head and looked directly toward our hiding spot on the ledge. It knew we were there. A wave of pure, primal fear washed over me, cold and sickening. This wasn't a dumb animal walking into a trap. This was a predator assessing a threat. "Holy," Leo breathed, his voice cracking. "What in God's name is that?" "Steady," Marcus murmured, his voice the only calm thing in our little bubble of terror. He had his rifle up, the stock pressed firmly against his shoulder. "Wait for a clean shot." Beside him, I did the same, my own scope finding the creature's chest. The crosshairs danced, betraying the tremor in my hands. Through the magnification, I could see the muscles ripple under its silver hide. I could see the faint wisp of its breath condensing in the frigid air. It was real, horribly, terrifyingly real. We needed a clean kill, a shot to the heart or the brain. Wounding something like that, the thought was unthinkable. "On my count," I whispered, trying to control my breathing, to slow my hammering heart. 3, 2... A deafening crack shattered the night. Frank, the impatient, greedy son of a bitch, had fired. The shot was a good one for what it was. It struck the creature high in the left shoulder. A spray of dark fluid, black in the moonlight, erupted from the wound. The beast buckled, and a sound tore from its throat that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It wasn't a howl or a roar. It was a fusion of both, a deep, guttural growl that escalated into a high-pitched, piercing scream of pure, human-like agony and rage. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a symphony of torment that scraped at the inside of my skull. "Fire!" Frank bellowed, already cycling another round into his chamber. The night exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up our ledge in strobing, epileptic bursts. The air filled with the sharp, cordite smell of gunpowder. Bullets whined through the air, kicking up puffs of snow and rock around the creature. It staggered under the onslaught, more dark patches appearing on its silvery coat. Any normal animal would have been dead 10 times over. A bear or a moose would have collapsed into a heap of meat and bone. But this thing, it absorbed the punishment. It stumbled. It fell to one knee, but it did not go down. Then, fueled by a terrifying, unholy rage, it moved. It coiled its long, powerful limbs and launched itself from the canyon floor. It wasn't a leap. It was a flight. It covered half the distance to our ledge, a good 50 yards, in a single impossible bound. It landed with a heavy, ground-shaking thud, sending a shower of snow and ice into the air. It was on our side of the canyon now, at the base of the cliff we were perched on. "Keep firing! Don't let it climb!" Owen yelled, his voice strained with panic. We rained bullets down on it. I emptied my magazine, slammed another one in, and kept shooting, no longer aiming, just pointing and firing at the monstrous shape below. I saw chunks of fur and flesh fly from its body. It roared again, that same soul-shredding scream, and began to scramble up the rock face. Its long claws, thick as daggers, found purchase in the frozen stone, gouging out handholds as it surged upward with terrifying speed. Its glowing eyes were fixed on us, filled with a promise of absolute butchery. It was 20 feet below us. Then 10. Its massive head rose over the edge of the ledge. I could smell it now, a rank, musky odor of wet fur, blood, and something else. Something ancient and earthy, like a freshly opened grave. Marcus, cool as ever, stood his ground, put the barrel of his .338 Lapua Magnum almost against the creature's forehead, and pulled the trigger. The impact was catastrophic. The creature's head snapped back with a wet, cracking sound. The light in its eyes extinguished. For a heart-stopping second, its claws held it there, suspended on the cliff face. Then, its grip failed. It peeled away from the rock and fell, tumbling end over end, landing on the snow-covered ground below with a final, heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Silence. The only sound was the frantic, ragged gasps of 6 men trying to remember how to breathe. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Below us, a huge silver shape lay motionless in a rapidly spreading pool of black blood. "We got it," Ben said, his voice a disbelieving whisper. "We actually got it." Frank let out a whoop of triumph, the sound jarring and profane in the sudden quiet. "150 grand, boys! Let's go get our trophy!" The euphoria was infectious, a heady cocktail of adrenaline and relief that momentarily washed away the bone-deep terror. We had faced a monster from the darkest corners of myth, and we had won. The money was ours. Frank was practically giddy, a rare sight for the stoic old trapper. He led the way down the treacherous goat path from our ledge to the canyon floor, his headlamp beam bouncing with his eager strides. "Be careful with the skull," he shouted back at us, his voice echoing in the vast silence. "Sterling wants it clean. No extra holes." I followed, my rifle held at a low ready, the unease from before returning with a vengeance. The creature's scream still rang in my ears, too intelligent, too full of a pain that felt more than just animal. As we got closer, the sheer scale of the thing was breathtaking. It was a mountain of fur and muscle, its limbs splayed at unnatural angles in the snow. The coppery scent of blood was thick in the air. Frank was the first to reach it, his laughter booming. "Look at the size of this son of a bitch. Sterling's gonna have to build a new room for this thing." He knelt beside the body, pulling out a large hunting knife. The rest of us gathered around, our headlamps converging on the kill. creating a stark, clinical circle of light in the overwhelming darkness. And that's when we started to notice it. "Hey," Leo said, his voice shaky. "Is it moving?" It wasn't. Not in the sense of being alive, but it was changing. The massive form seemed to be deflating. The great barrel chest was sinking, the powerful shoulders narrowing. The long silver fur appeared to retract, melting back into the skin like frost on a warming window pane. A low, wet, crackling sound filled the air, the sound of bones grinding and reshaping themselves under the skin. "What the hell is happening?" Owen whispered, taking a step back. Frank, who had been about to make his first cut, froze, his knife hovering over the shifting form. His triumphant grin had vanished, replaced by a mask of horrified disbelief. We watched, mesmerized and appalled, as the monstrous anatomy dissolved. The elongated canine snout shortened and flattened. The powerful digitigrade legs straightened and stretched, the joints realigning into a human configuration. The silver fur vanished completely, revealing pale skin, slick with blood and amniotic fluid. In less than a minute, the gargantuan, wolf-like creature was gone. Lying in its place, sprawled on the blood-soaked snow, was a man. He was tall and leanly muscled, completely naked despite the sub-zero temperatures. His skin was deathly pale, a stark contrast to the long, jet-black hair that was matted with gore around his face and shoulders. His features were sharp, almost noble, but his face was a mask of agony, his eyes wide open and staring sightlessly at the indifferent, star-dusted sky. His body was riddled with bullet holes, ugly, dark wounds that marred the perfection of his form. He was unequivocally, irrevocably human. And he was dead. The silence that fell was more profound than any we had yet experienced. The six of us stood frozen, staring at the corpse of the man we had just slaughtered. The elation of the hunt curdled into a sick, gut-wrenching horror. We weren't hunters. We were murderers. Leo started to gag, turning away to retch violently into the snow. Ben just stared, his young face ashen, his eyes wide with a trauma that would never leave him. It was Marcus who finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper, freighted with a terrible, ancient knowledge. He looked at the body, then at the dark, watching trees around us. "Adikadaga." The word was Athabascan, a strange, guttural sound on his lips. He saw our blank looks and translated, his voice hollow. The two-souled. My grandmother used to tell stories, warnings. She said they were protectors of this land. He took a deep, shuddering breath. It wasn't a wolf. It was a shifter. The word hung in the frozen air, heavy and damning. Shifter. It unlocked a part of my brain that dealt with folklore and campfire stories, things I'd always dismissed as superstition. But the proof was lying at our feet, cooling in the snow. Frank finally found his voice, a raw, furious rasp. "No, it was an animal. I saw it. We all saw it." He gestured wildly at the body with his bloody knife. "This is a trick. Some kind of illusion." But his words were empty, his bravado shattered. Even he couldn't deny the evidence of his own eyes. The trophy was gone. The money was gone. And in their place was this atrocity. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. We were 100 miles from anywhere, in a valley that was clearly not meant for men, and we had just killed one of its guardians. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "Now." "What about him?" Owen asked, nodding toward the body. "We leave him," Frank snarled, a new, feral fear in his eyes. "We leave him and we never talk about this again. We tell Sterling the beast got away. We take the loss and we go home." No one argued. The decision was unanimous, born of a shared primal terror. We turned our backs on the dead man in the snow, leaving him to the darkness and the cold. We scrambled back up the path, our movements clumsy with haste, each man desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of our crime. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the Alaskan air, that you can't just walk away from something like this. The valley was watching, and it would not forget. We didn't just walk back to the snowmobiles, we fled. Every snap of a frozen twig, every whisper of wind through the skeletal trees sounded like a footstep behind us. The triumphant hike to claim our prize had become a panicked, disorderly retreat. The air, which had felt crisp and clean just an hour before, now felt thick and suffocating, charged with a malevolent energy. We reached the machines, fumbling with keys and starters with numb, clumsy fingers. The sudden roar of the 6 engines was a welcome, profane noise in the crushing silence. We gunned them, tearing away from the canyon, our headlights cutting frantic, bouncing paths through the darkness. We were a cavalry in full retreat, and then we heard it. It started as a single mournful note that rose from the direction of the canyon we just left. It was a sound of profound, soul-deep grief, a lament that seemed to make the very air vibrate. But beneath the sorrow was a current of pure, undiluted rage. It was a wolf's howl, yet it was more than that. It carried the weight of a human cry, a promise of vengeance spoken in a language older than words. Before the first howl had faded, it was answered. Another rose up from the ridge to our left. Then a third from the woods to our right. Soon, the night was alive with them. They came from every direction, a chorus of spectral voices that surrounded us, trapped us in a bubble of sound. It was as if the mountains themselves had found a voice and were screaming their fury at us. They weren't just howling at the moon. They were howling for us. For our blood. As if summoned by the unholy chorus, the weather turned. The clear, star-dusted sky vanished in an instant, blotted out by a sudden churning mass of black clouds that boiled over the mountain peaks. The wind, which had been a persistent whisper, became a physical assault, a roaring, shrieking gale that carried with it a blinding wall of snow.
"White out!"
Marcus yelled over the comms, his voice distorted by static and wind.
"Stay close, follow my lead."
Visibility dropped to near zero. The world became a swirling vortex of white, our headlamps illuminating nothing but the frantic, hypnotic dance of snowflakes just inches in front of our faces. It was a classic Alaskan whiteout, a disorienting, terrifying phenomenon that could swallow a man whole and leave no trace. We were driving blind, navigating by instinct, and the faint red taillight of the snowmobile in front. The cold intensified. The wind driving frozen particles into every gap in our clothing like a sandblaster firing needles of ice. It felt like an eternity, but we eventually stumbled back into the relative sanctuary of our camp. The tents were barely visible, vague domes already being buried by the rapidly accumulating snow. We abandoned the snowmobiles and scrambled inside the largest of the expedition tents, a dome designed for communal use. Owen, ever practical, tried to get the portable propane heater going, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely strike the igniter. The wind howled outside, plucking and tearing at the tent fabric, making it groan and shudder like a living thing in pain. We were trapped. "We need a watch," Marcus said, his voice a steady anchor in our rising sea of panic. "2-man shifts, 1 hour each. We can't let them sneak up on us." No one argued. The first shift fell to Frank and me. The others huddled in their sleeping bags, feigning sleep, but fooling no one. Frank and I zipped up the tent flap and stood outside, our backs to the thin nylon wall, rifles in hand. The storm was a living entity, a screaming white monster that clawed at our faces and tried to rip the breath from our lungs. Our powerful headlamps could barely penetrate 10 feet into the swirling chaos. Beyond that small bubble of light was a formless, roaring void. For a long time we stood in silence, just two men against the storm and the horrors it concealed.
Finally, Frank spoke, his voice low and ragged, barely audible over the wind. My grandfather, he used to tell stories. He trapped these same mountains back in the 30s. He spat on the ground, the saliva freezing before it hit the snow. He called them the Kenani, the land spirits. Said they could wear the skins of wolves or men. Said they protected their own. If you wronged one, the whole pack would hunt you down. No matter how far you ran, he let out a short, harsh laugh, devoid of any humor. I always thought he was just a crazy old bastard full of liquor and tall tales. He turned to look at me, his eyes barely visible behind his snow-caked goggles. The fear he'd been trying to mask with anger was now naked on his face. Looks like the old fool knew what he was talking about. The wind shrieked, and for a moment I thought I saw a shape in the swirling snow just at the edge of my light. Something tall and dark and impossibly fast. I raised my rifle, my heart leaping into my throat. But when I blinked, it was gone. It was just the storm. Just the wind playing tricks on a terrified mind. At least, that's what I told myself. The hour-long watch felt like a lifetime spent in purgatory. The relentless wind scoured every last bit of warmth from my body, leaving behind a deep, aching cold that settled in my bones. My mind played tricks on me. Every gust of wind sounded like a growl. Every dancing shadow at the edge of my headlamp's beam looked like a lunging figure. Frank stood beside me, a silent, rigid statue, his fear manifesting as a tense, coiled stillness. When Marcus and Owen finally emerged to relieve us, I practically fell back into the main tent, my limbs stiff and unresponsive. Sleep was impossible. The five of us lay in our sleeping bags, a tight circle of armed, terrified men. We were listening to the storm rage outside and listening for something more. The howl of the wind was a constant, nerve-shredding shriek, but underneath it we all strained to hear a different sound. The soft crunch of a footstep in the snow, the low growl of a predator. I must have drifted into a state of exhausted delirium, because the scream jolted me back to full heart-pounding consciousness. It was short, not a long, drawn-out cry of terror, but a choked, gurgling sound that was cut off almost as soon as it began. It came from the small two-man tent right next to ours, Ben's tent. For a second, we were all paralyzed. Then Marcus moved, a blur of action. Get your lights on, now!
We scrambled for our headlamps and rifles, our movements frantic and clumsy in the cramped space. Frank ripped open the flap of our tent and we spilled out into the roaring blizzard. The wind tore at us, threatening to knock us off our feet. We aimed our lights at Ben's tent, just 20 feet away. The sight that greeted us turned my blood to ice. The side of the dome tent facing away from us was in tatters. It hadn't been unzipped or cut. It had been ripped open, the high-tensile fabric torn apart as if it were tissue paper. 3 long parallel gashes ran from the top of the dome to the ground, the work of immense, powerful claws. "Ben!" I yelled, my voice stolen by the wind. Marcus was already there, his rifle up as he peered into the dark, gaping maw in the side of the tent. He swept his light inside. The beam illuminated a scene of swift, savage violence. Ben's sleeping bag was a mangled, bloody ruin, slashed to ribbons. The snow inside the tent was churned and stained with a dark, wet red that was already starting to freeze. But of Ben, there was no sign. Just a dragged trail of blood leading from the ripped tent out into the swirling white chaos of the storm. It had gotten into the camp. Despite our watch, despite the storm that should have offered us cover, one of them had crept in, silent as a ghost. It had chosen its target, struck with lethal precision, and vanished back into the blizzard with its prize, all in a matter of seconds. "He's gone," Owen stated, his voice flat with shock. Leo started to hyperventilate, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "It got him. Oh God, it took him."
"Everyone in the main tent, now!"
Frank bellowed, his voice cutting through the panic. "Form a circle!" Weapons ready. We scrambled back into the relative safety of the large dome, piling gear against the zippered flap as a makeshift barricade. We huddled together in the center, back to back, a pathetic, shivering knot of humanity. Our rifle barrels pointed out at the thin nylon walls that separated us from the horrors outside. The animal terror was absolute. This wasn't a hunt anymore. We weren't the predators. We were the bait, trapped in a flimsy cage while something ancient and intelligent and filled with a righteous fury circled us in the dark. It hadn't been a random attack. It was an execution. They were picking us off one by one. The wind howled its mournful, mocking song. The flimsy tent walls shuddered under its assault. We sat there in the flickering glow of our headlamps, listening, waiting. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a death knell. There was no sleep for the rest of that night. There was only the storm, the cold, and the suffocating, claustrophobic certainty that we were all going to die here. The only question was who would be next. Dawn did not break. It seeped into the world, a gradual lightening of the oppressive darkness into a uniform, soupy gray. The blizzard had not stopped, but its fury had lessened. The shrieking gale had subsided into a steady, moaning wind, and the snow now fell in thick, heavy flakes, clinging to everything and muffling the world in a blanket of white. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and dread. No one had slept. Our faces were pale and drawn in the cold morning light, our eyes wide and bloodshot. The silence between us was heavier than any conversation. We were 5 now. Ben's absence was a physical void in our small group. "We have to make a call to the pilot," Leo said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Call for a rescue." "Now, the satellite phone's useless in this storm," Marcus replied, his tone weary but firm. "No signal. Even if we got through, no pilot is flying in this. We're on our own until it clears." The finality of his words hung in the air. We were cut off. Owen, who had been unnaturally still all night, finally shifted. I have to take a leak," he mumbled, his face a mask of misery. "I can't hold it any longer." "You're not going out there alone," I said immediately. "Marcus and I will go with you." "I'm not a child," Owen snapped, a rare flash of irritation from the quiet man. "I'm just going behind that snowdrift." 20 steps. You can see me the whole time. He was embarrassed, but he was also desperate. Frank nodded grimly. "All right, but be quick. We'll cover you from the flap." Owen nodded, his relief palpable. Frank and I unzipped the tent just enough to poke our rifles through, creating a narrow field of view. Owen trudged out into the deep snow, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He moved toward a large, sculpted drift about 20 yards from the tent, just as he'd said. He was a dark, solitary figure against the swirling gray and white. He unzipped his parka and turned his back to us. We kept our rifles trained on the woods and the sky around him, scanning for any sign of movement. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Then came the scream. It wasn't like Ben's. Owen's was a full-throated, horribly gargled cry of agony and surprise that was brutally cut short. Something had burst from the other side of the snowdrift. We didn't see it clearly. It was a blur of silver fur and impossible speed. It rose up from the snow like a ghost, its form indistinct in the thick snowfall. We saw Owen's body lifted from the ground as if he were a rag doll, heard the sickening, wet snap of his neck breaking, and then he was gone, pulled back over the drift and out of sight. "Owen!" I screamed, pushing out of the tent. Marcus and Frank were right behind me. We floundered through the waist-deep snow, reaching the drift in seconds. But we were too late. Owen lay face down in the snow, his head twisted at an impossible angle. There were no other tracks besides his own leading to the spot. The creature had come from under the snow itself, tunneling beneath the drift to lie in wait. We were being hunted by creatures that could move like shadows, strike from nowhere, and use the very terrain as a weapon against us. That was the final straw for Leo. His mind simply shattered. A wild, panicked shriek ripped from his throat. "No, no more. I'm not dying here. I'm getting out." Before any of us could stop him, he turned and sprinted toward the snowmobiles. "Leo, wait, don't!" Marcus yelled. "We stick together!" But Leo wasn't listening. He was in the grip of a pure, animal panic. He vaulted onto his machine, his hands shaking so violently it took him 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life with a desperate scream. "They can't catch me on this," he shrieked over the noise, his eyes wide and insane. "They can't!" He twisted the throttle, and the snowmobile shot forward, throwing a massive rooster tail of snow into the air. He disappeared into the gray, swirling curtain of the storm, a man fleeing his own death. We stood there, the 3 of us who were left, and listened. For about a minute, the only sound was the fading whine of his engine. Then, from the direction he'd gone, came a new sound, a chorus of triumphant, savage howls. They were answered by Leo's final, terrified scream, a long, high-pitched wail of utter horror that was cut off with shocking, absolute finality. Then, silence. The only sound left was the mournful sigh of the wind and the soft, steady whisper of the falling snow. It was just the 3 of us now: Ethan, Frank, and Marcus. The party was melting away like snow in the sun, and we knew, with cold, hard certainty, that the hunters were just getting started. The deaths of Owen and Leo, so swift and brutal, broke something in us. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut, but it was now overlaid with a grim, fatalistic resolve. We were no longer prey waiting to be slaughtered. If we were going to die, we were going to make it costly. We retreated to the tattered remnants of our camp. The silence was absolute, broken only by our own ragged breathing. Frank's face, usually a mask of cynical bravado, had hardened into something else entirely. It was the face of a man who had looked into the abyss and was now prepared to spit in its eye. Without a word, he trudged to his gear pile and unstrapped a heavy, waterproof canvas roll from the side of his rucksack. He undid the ties, and my eyes widened. Inside were 6 sticks of dynamite, complete with blasting caps and a coil of fuse. "Where in the hell did you get that?" Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "Always carry a little something extra," Frank grunted, his fingers working with practiced efficiency, wiring a cap to one of the sticks. "Used to do some prospecting up on the Yukon. Good for clearing rock falls, or," he added, his eyes glinting with a cold fire, "for greeting unwanted guests. A plan began to form, a desperate last-ditch strategy born of sheer necessity. We couldn't outrun them. We couldn't hide from them. So we would make our stand here. We would turn our camp into a fortress, a tomb if necessary. As the gray light of the false dawn grew stronger, the snow began to taper off. The thick, swirling flakes thinned to a light dusting, and the oppressive fog started to lift. Visibility increased from 20 yards to 50, then 100, and with the clearing view came the sight we had all been dreading. They were there. On the edge of the tree line, ringing the frozen lake, they stood. At first, I counted 8, then 10, a dozen. A pack of the silver-furred giants, standing motionless, like statues carved from ice and shadow. They weren't snarling or agitated. They were simply watching us, their intelligent, glowing eyes fixed on our camp. It was a siege. They weren't just a pack. They were an army. They were waiting. One of them, larger than the rest, its fur almost completely white with age or status, took a single deliberate step forward. It was the alpha, the leader. It lowered its massive head and let out a low, rumbling growl that was not a challenge, but a death sentence. "That's our signal," Marcus said, his voice devoid of fear. He chambered around in his rifle. "It's been an honor serving with you again, Ethan." "You too, Marcus," I said, my throat tight. Frank finished his work. He had placed the dynamite charges in a rough circle around our central tent, burying them in the snow with fuses running back to our position. "Let them get close," he snarled. "Let them think they have us." The great white wolf took another step forward. Marcus, ever the sharpshooter, didn't hesitate. He brought his rifle to his shoulder, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. The heavy caliber bullet struck the alpha square in the chest. It staggered, a dark stain blossoming on its white fur, and then collapsed into the snow. For a heartbeat, the entire pack was still. Then, as one, they broke. The silent, watchful siege exploded into a tidal wave of silver fur and snapping jaws. They charged across the open snowfield, covering the ground with an impossible loping speed. They didn't howl or roar. They ran in an eerie, purposeful silence that was more terrifying than any war cry. "Now," I yelled. "Not yet," Frank countered, his hand hovering over the first fuse, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Closer, closer. They were 100 yards out, then 50. I could see their individual eyes now, burning with cold fury. I could see the steam jetting from their nostrils. "Light it!" Marcus yelled, firing into the charging mass. A wolf went down, its leg shattering, but 2 more ran right over it without breaking stride. Frank lit the first fuse with his lighter. It sizzled, a tiny, spitting snake of fire against the white snow. The pack was 20 yards away. He lit the second fuse, then a third. "Get to the sleds! Go!" he roared. The first charge went off. A massive geyser of snow, ice, and black earth erupted from the ground, throwing 2 of the lead wolves into the air like discarded toys. The concussive blast hit me like a physical blow, staggering me. In the chaos of the explosion, Frank, Marcus, and I broke for the 2 remaining snowmobiles. I vaulted onto mine, my hands fumbling with the ignition. The engine screamed to life. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Frank was on his sled, revving the engine. But Marcus wasn't. He was on one knee, firing methodically into the pack, providing cover. He was buying us time. As I watched in horror, 2 of the beasts, ignoring the explosions, broke from the main charge and swerved toward him. They hit him at the same time, one from the front, one from the side. He went down under a whirlwind of claws and teeth. I saw a flash of his knife, a final, defiant act, and then he was gone, submerged beneath the writhing silver bodies. A second explosion rocked the camp, and then a third.
"Ethan, go!"
Frank's voice screamed in my ear. There was nothing I could do for Marcus. Grief and rage warred inside me, but survival took over. I twisted the throttle, and the snowmobile leaped forward, fishtailing onto the frozen surface of the lake. I looked back one last time. Frank was right behind me. Behind us, the burning fuses of the last dynamite charges were hissing in the snow, and our camp was being overrun by monsters.
The frozen lake was a vast, unforgiving sheet of white. It offered no cover, no sanctuary, only a straight, desperate line to the far shore miles away. The engines of our snowmobiles screamed, pushing the machines to their limits, the treads chewing at the snow-covered ice. Behind us, the last of the dynamite erupted, a final, defiant roar from our ruined camp. But it hadn't been enough. They were coming. They poured out of the trees and onto the ice, a silver tide of vengeance. I had thought the snowmobiles would give us an advantage, that we could outrun them. I was wrong. Their long, powerful limbs ate up the distance with a terrifying, loping grace. They were impossibly fast, their claws finding purchase on the ice where our machines threatened to skid and slide. They didn't chase us from behind. They fanned out, running parallel to us, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. One of them drew level with me, a massive, dark-furred beast with a scarred muzzle. It lunged, its jaws snapping shut inches from my leg. I kicked out wildly, my heavy boot connecting with its head. It yelped and fell back, but another immediately took its place. I drew my sidearm, a heavy .44 Magnum, and started firing with one hand, steering with the other. It was a desperate, inaccurate spray of lead. I saw one of the creatures tumble, its legs tangled beneath it. But the pack was too large, too relentless. They were hurting us, forcing us toward the center of the lake, away from the safety of the trees. I glanced over at Frank. He was fighting his own battle, a half-dozen of the shifters swarming his machine. He was using his shotgun now, the boom of the 12-gauge a rhythmic punctuation to the chaos. But for everyone he blasted back, two more closed in. Then the pack executed a maneuver with chilling military precision. A group of them surged ahead, cutting across Frank's path, forcing him to swerve violently. His snowmobile skidded, lost traction, and spun out, coming to a halt in a cloud of snow. He was surrounded, cut off. "Frank!"
I yelled, starting to turn my machine. "No!" he roared back, his voice carrying clearly across the ice.
"Keep going! Get out of here!"
He was trapped. His snowmobile was penned in by a solid wall of silver bodies. He stood up on the seat, the shotgun empty in his hands. He looked at me and across the 100 yards that separated us. Our eyes met. There was no fear in his gaze. There was no panic. There was only a cold, hard resolve. The old trapper, the cynical, greedy man, was gone. In his place was a warrior making his final stand. He dropped the useless shotgun and reached into the front pocket of his parka. He pulled out the last 2 sticks of dynamite, bound together with black electrical tape. The fuse was short, dangerously short. He looked from the dynamite in his hand to the snarling, closing circle of monsters. Then he looked back at me one last time and gave a short, sharp nod. It was a goodbye. A final order. The shifters leaped. They surged forward as one, a wave of claws and fangs intent on tearing him to pieces. As the first one hit him, he lit the fuse. I saw the tiny spark, the brief, brilliant flare against the white snow. I saw Frank disappear under the mass of bodies. Then the world turned white. A silent, blinding flash of light, followed a microsecond later by a deafening roar that was more of a physical force than a sound. The shock wave hit me, lifting my snowmobile and me into the air. I was thrown from the machine, tumbling through a world of noise and pain. I hit the ice hard, my head cracking against the surface with a sickening crunch. My vision swam, black spots dancing before my eyes. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the sky, filled with a shower of red and black and silver, raining down upon the frozen lake. The last thing I heard was the echo of the explosion, rolling across the empty, indifferent mountains. Consciousness returned in fragments. The smell of antiseptic, the soft scratch of wool blankets, the low, steady beep of a machine. For a long time, I drifted in a fog of pain and medication, the events on the lake playing over and over in my mind like a broken film. The glowing eyes, Marcus going down, Frank's final defiant nod. A search party, dispatched by Sterling when we missed our pickup window, found me 2 days later. I was curled beside my overturned snowmobile, unconscious, suffering from a severe concussion, 2 broken ribs, and frostbite that had blackened the tips of 3 fingers on my left hand. Of the shifters, there was little evidence, save for the crater in the ice and the scattered frozen remains of what the search party's report would officially call unusually large, aggressive wolves. The official story was neat and tidy, a hunting expedition gone horribly wrong, a sudden, unprovoked attack by a wolf pack of unprecedented size and ferocity. The deaths of 4 hunters were attributed to the animals. Frank's death, and the deaths of several wolves, were blamed on the accidental detonation of prospecting equipment during the chaos. It was a plausible, digestible tragedy for the evening news. No one asked too many questions. Mr. Sterling paid for everything. The best doctors, the best care. It was all handled by a lawyer with a tight smile and a sealed envelope containing my $25,000 share. Sterling never contacted me directly. I had failed to deliver his trophy, but I had delivered a story that kept his name and his obsessions out of the papers. For him, that was a bargain. I went home. The money, stained with blood and horror, paid for my mother's treatment. It bought her another year, a year of relative comfort for which I was both profoundly grateful and eternally damned. The money was a constant, heavy reminder of the price. 5 good men, 1 who was not a man at all. I never went back into the woods. I couldn't. The rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep in the snow. The silhouette of a tree against the sky looked like a waiting predator. I sold my rifles. I took a job in the city, stocking shelves at a hardware store, surrounding myself with the safe, predictable angles of concrete and steel. But you can't escape the wilderness that you carry inside you. Every night I see the glowing eyes in the dark. Every night I hear that scream, half man, half beast, echoing in the canyons of my memory. Sometimes when a siren wails in the distance or a neighborhood dog lets out a lonely howl, I flinch. My hand involuntarily goes to my cheek, to a thin, pale scar that runs from my temple to my jaw, a parting gift, a piece of shrapnel from Frank's final act, or a claw that caught me as I was thrown clear. I don't know which. I survived. I got the money. But sitting here in the quiet of my small apartment, listening to the sounds of a city that feels a million miles from the truth, I know that I left the most important parts of myself back there. Frozen in the ice, buried in the snow, a part of me will forever remain in the valley of long shadows, a permanent, ghostly resident of that vast, silent, and hungry Alaskan wilderness. I had paid an awful price for someone else's trophy,